Hello, everyone. Welcome to Chapter 1, Introduction to Developmental Psychology. Before I begin, let me note that there are a number of videos and that I've embedded within the PowerPoint, which is why the files are so large. So you can either watch them in the PowerPoint, or if they're from a YouTube channel, I link them in the notes, which you can click, or which you can bring up by clicking the Notes tab at the bottom of the screen. All right, so let's jump into this. So beginning with defining development. So what is development? So a theme in this course is that there's really no one definition of anything, but we're going to pick one definition and we're just going to ride with it. It's called operationally defining something. So we can actually, do science. We're not going to argue about definitions all day. So, all right, so to begin with, development is the systematic changes and continuities in the individual that occur between conception and death. We're going to look at three types of development throughout this entire course. And that's physical development, cognitive development, and psychosocial development. I should say that this book will be presented in chronological order. So each chapter will be a different life phase. So defining, the three types of development, which you can see on the screen. Physical development is the growth of the body and its organs. Cognitive development is changes and continuities in perception, language, learning, memory, problem solving. And psychosocial development is personal and interceptional aspects of development, motives, emotions, personality traits, relationships. Of course, all these types of development interact dynamically. So for example, say a child is learning to crawl. Okay, well, that's a physical development, but also by learning to crawl, they can follow their parent around. They can encounter more interactions among the parents and their friends, or the parent and the child, etc. And then by interacting with those social dynamics, their cognitive skills also develop. So you can see these kind of dynamic processes, and they don't occur in isolation, is really the key point. So again, defining development, we have growth, biological aging, aging. So growth is physical changes that occur from conception to maturity. Biological aging is the deterioration of organisms that lead to death. And aging is defined as physical, cognitive, and psychosocial changes, positive and negative, in the mature organism. So what does that mean? The difference between biological aging and aging is really, you can imagine a 10-year-old who has, some kind of chronic disease and, is going to have a severe chronic disease that reduces their lifespan. So biologically, they could be much older than what their, actual age is. So, and another example, you can compare two 60-year-olds. I'm sure you've seen older adults, some who are very unhealthy and some that are, quite healthy for their age, even though they're the exact same age. And that's kind of what biological aging is getting at. But each developmental change that occurs within an organism, a person in this case, involves gains, losses, and neutral changes. So, it's the idea that just because you're aging doesn't mean, you're losing cognitive abilities, social abilities at every, year. So for example, you could acquire wisdom with age. You acquire new vocabulary. You develop better working memory. So alongside, aging, which, are generally associated with the slower processing speeds, there's also gains. So conceptualizing the lifespan, we have age grade. An age grade refers to a socially defined age group in a society, assigned different roles, responsibilities, statuses, and privileges. The legal definitions vary in separating children into grades in schools based on age, driving, voting, drugs. So basically the idea here is that different ages, societies grant certain privileges and responsibilities based on age. So, when you're 18, you can, smoke a cigarette or whatever. 21, you can drink alcohol. And those are all obviously, based within a historical period. So, you can never drink alcohol legally during prohibition. And these obviously are cross-culturally dependent. Each country has different laws, privileges, and responsibilities associated with a particular age. All right. So looking at subcultural differences, I'm going to refer to, instead of SES, I'm probably going to use the terms class and poor and rich. I mean, that's more straightforward. SES, I've found, is kind of poorly defined. Then it rarely means the same thing, um, and it's not specific. So I'm going to stick with just class and poor and kind of richer in general. So, subcultural differences, class, children in poverty experience more noise, pollution, crowding, family disruption, hunger, exposure to violence. And the idea here is that accumulation of stressors, so hunger, being exposed to violence, noise, accumulates within an individual. And that accumulation um, impacts all developmental outcomes. So it's a totality of these individual stressors coming together, which harms development. Individuals from lower income families tend to reach milestones of adulthood earlier, and that's because they're asked to grow up fast. So imagine yourself in a war-torn region and you're 13 years old. You're going to have more responsibilities than someone making $200,000 a year in the United States, just based on the demands of the circumstance. And I should say that in the US, about 1 in every 5 children live in poverty, and 1 in every 3 children of color live in poverty. And these are kind of the major themes that we're going to see through this class. So again, really focusing on that accumulation of stress. Another one is historical changes. So childhood, children comes to be viewed as different from adults in the 17th century. Emerging adulthood is defined in the late 20th and early 21st century, and old age, defined as old age as a period of retirement in the 20th century. So again, look at the historical periods here. Look at old age. So the old age was defined differently, in the 1800s. One, because we didn't live that long. Two, because Social Security didn't exist. So these are recent phenomenon that impact development. And the same thing with childhood, because children live to different ages. There's going to be different responsibilities. There's going to be different privileges granted to children, in the 1600s versus today. And same thing with emerging adulthood. You see more children going to college now. So you have this, instead of, immediately starting a family, you have this period, where there's 1, 2, 3, 4, shit, 11 years in college, that's a recent phenomenon, especially on, seen on a wide scale. It's not just like 5 people who are the ultra wealthy going to college. I mean, you're going to pick up more student loan debt, obviously, but there's a larger population, going to college, definitely going to public school, before public school even existed. So those historical eras impact development. So how might COVID affect development? Well, changes in life expectancy due to COVID based on ethnicity. And you can see, obviously, when, an estimated 1 million people die, life expectancy is going to go down. So that's, a dramatic example of how the historical period or these large scale traumas harm development. And specifically, certain classes and races are at greater risk of harmful impacts from that trauma, in this case, COVID-19. Now let's walk through Bolt's 7 features of lifespan developmental psychology. And some of them we've already covered, and I'm not going to read all these things, but development is a lifelong process. So kind of the old school way of thinking was, okay, you develop until, you're 10, 12, say 18 years old, and then you're done. No more development. But that's not how development is seen now. Development is thought of as a lifelong process. Development is also multi-directional. Different aspects of human functioning have different developmental trajectories. So the idea here is certain psychological concepts develop at different rates. So, I mean, an easy example would be is reading ability. So as children get older, they learn to read better, right? And it becomes much more automatic process. So look to your right, you see this is a classic test. you see the word yellow um, with colored in red. So if you told a child to, identify what color that word yellow is, they would probably say the word yellow because this is an automatic process. So they actually increase errors because they've become more proficient at reading and their ability to inhibit um, saying the word yellow has not yet developed. So you have two kind of different tracks of development, inhibition and reading skills, and one is ahead of the other. And that causes certain errors in psychological tasks. And like I said before, it involves gains and losses. Historical cultural context shapes development, and nature and nurture interact. So that's kind of a common theme within this book, nature and nurture interacting. There is no kind of old school nature versus nurture. It's understood now that the environment impacts genes and impacts biological processes and vice versa, biological processes impacting, your mood, for example. you know, so that's understood now, and we'll get into more specific examples of nature and nurture interacting at biological and genetic examples later on. And development is best understood through interdisciplinary studies. Development psychology is everything. So, like I've illustrated so far, you see all these features of development: historical, cultural, economic. We saw COVID, public health. Development is impacted by so many different factors that it almost by default has to be an interdisciplinary study, just because it's impacted by so many things, and how you can study it can vary. So I can to study the impact of the Great Depression on childhood cognitive development. I can choose to study the impact of nuclear waste on social skills. It's so multifaceted that is inherently an interdisciplinary concept. So I just want to define culture real quick. And it's kind of two examples, or well, two sub-definitions of culture. And the first is it's a type of information. So information acquired from others through social learning that can influence behavior. So for example, culture can be any idea, belief, technology, or practice that you have learned from other people. So it's literally the passing on of information. And again, all these concepts we're going to expand on more in the future. It's also refers to a particular group of individuals, a group of people within a shared context, historical, linguistic, geographical. So people within a given context are exposed to many of the same cultural ideas, so they tend to share beliefs, practices, and so forth. So you should, you see this in the United States, kind of pockets of regions that interact with similar environments and have similar ideas, which shapes the region or specific areas culture. And you can see this, not just politics, but like movies, for example. If I, uh, speak English or I'm capable, well, like I said, you see this at the regional level. So you're exposed to certain similar kind of ideas, beliefs, practices, and through that kind of shared exposure, you develop culture, a commonality among people within that region. And everyone, including us. Thoughts and behaviors appear natural to use, but because we really don't know how we think and behave otherwise, we are socialized to think that particular ways of doing things are good and moral. So the idea is each person's thoughts and behaviors are thought to be part of this innate process, this thing that's automatic. But really, it's the impact of our specific culture and historical eras, etc., that are influencing, our psychological processes and our developmental outcomes. We recognize our own ethnocentrism, judging other cultures by comparing them to our culture, using our own culture as a standard of comparison. Cultural relativity, an appreciation of cultural differences and understanding. So basically, the idea is ethnocentrism kind of gets at that idea that the way I do things is like the universally correct way to do things, when really, it's a product of much larger factors going on. Now, two important topics to look at is lifespan versus life expectancy. Lifespan or longevity refers to the length of time a species can exist under most optimal conditions. So, for example, you put a particular animal in a zoo and they have, theoretically optimal everything social environment. Um, they're probably going to reach the maximum amount of um, years they're capable of living. That is, they're capable of reaching the entirety of their species specific lifespan. In humans, is estimated to be 120-ish years or so. But obviously, on average, people do not live that long. Life expectancy refers to the predicted number of years a person born in a particular time period can reasonably expect to live. So in 1800, you're probably, we know now that you weren't most likely on average going to live to 80 years old. Well, today's average lifespan's, whatever it is, upper 70s. So that's basically the difference. The longevity, which is the peak potential that you can reach, and your life expectancy, which is like your average expected lifespan based on your historical area. And I should include race class as well. So life transitions in adulthood, social transitions in later years. Chronological age is not always a good predictor of measuring development. And we already looked at biological age, and like we said before, estimate of age in terms of biological functioning. So you can be uh, 40 years old and have been a chronic smoker, for example, and have the lungs of a 90-year-old. Versus a 90-year-old who never smoked and might have the lungs of a 40-year-old. You have psychological age, a person's mental attitudes and capability to deal with stress and changing environments. Some people display little changes in memory and personality with age. So, we know people, I'm sure you know people that have had similar attitudes and ability to deal with stress throughout their, however long you've known them, even if it's, 5, 10 years. Some people they develop at different rates if they're developing at all in their psychological age. Their functional age is ability to function in given roles in society. So, AKA how that person functions in daily life. So, are you capable of, going to work, taking a shower, cooking your food, etc. Social age, whether people behave in accord with the social behaviors appropriate for their age. That is, dress your age, a sports car. So basically, the idea here is act your own age. So there's kind of an expectation based on your age. So, if you're 60 years old, the idea is like you're not supposed to buy a sports car and go street racing, for example, or even though you're inverse, an 8-year-old reading, I don't know, some complex book or something like that. They're acting advanced for their age. In the other example, where I don't know, a 6-year-old is street racing, they're acting, immature or below their age. Now we'll jump into periods of development. I'm not going to read all this, but this is basically how this book is going to work. We're going to work our way through development in a chronological order. So nature and nurture, I touched on this early on, and nature and nurture refers to how biological forces and environmental forces act and interact to make us what we are, and I should add who we are. Nature refers to some aspects of development are inborn or innate. Others are the product of maturation in genes and predictable processes. So the idea here is that we're all born with certain sets of genes and certain kind of developmental trajectories within the brain. We expect at a certain age, you're going to learn how to walk, you're going to learn how to talk, you're going to learn how to crawl, etc. You're going to learn how to eat on your own, and that's kind of the thought process is that there's an innate process that predicts that development within an individual versus nurture, which is change in response to environment or learning, parenting, peers, class, trauma, historical period. So the idea here is environment affects development. So, like I just said, nature would believe that there is kind of an innate process to language learning. But if I locked you in a cell from the day you were born to 5 years old, that would probably impact your language development skills, and we kind of know that it does. So that's an example of nature impacting a developmental outcome. In that case, you can see nature and nurture are interacting. Components of theories: continuity and discontinuity. So this kind of gets at the question, is developmental change gradual or abrupt? You get a little taller a year, a little better at reading, or one day you just know how to read. You just know how to talk, for example. It's quantitative or qualitative, so that's one aspect of this. And that's the degree of change, more of something, continuity, that refers to quantitative, or qualitative change, which refers to change in kind / fundamental, puberty. So again, the idea here is that one day you have either a sudden growth spurt in puberty versus kind of that continual continuity change in height. So it's kind of this sudden spurt, this fundamental change through puberty versus like this gradual height. And you really see both across development. And continuity theorists, they argue for gradual and quantitative change. So that is kind of like a little build up, like kind of going up that hill, and and this degree of change. So going up that hill and continuously, improving or decreasing, whatever. Versus discontinuity theorists, which are abrupt and qualitative. So you can see kind of the right side figure. It's kind of like steps up a ladder or something along those lines. So one day, language. It's about these fundamental changes, these spurts. They're abrupt and they fundamentally shift, who you are as a person through this new skill, whether that's talking, reading, etc. So moving on to another component of these theories is activity versus passivity. So this is kind of centered around the extent to which human beings are active in producing their own development or are passively shaped. So activity refers to humans are active species, and they orchestrate their own development through exploration and shaping their environment. So the idea is, you're a young child and you have this kind of innate active self-discovery approach to interacting with the world. And that is what is contributing to your development. Versus passivity, which refers to humans are passive recipients of environmental factors. Development is shaped largely by forces beyond their control, environmental influences, or biology. So the idea here is, you're developing and you're getting hit with either some kind of genetics, you're getting hit with some kind of biological change or some other environmental influence. Your city gets bombed all of a sudden, and that's probably going to impact your developmental outcomes. Now, again, we see that both of these components of developments are important in developmental outcomes. So just kind of one quick example of universality versus context specificity. So this refers to the extent to which developmental changes are universal or different across cultures. Stage theorists argue that theorized stages are universal. So you see this with Freud, Erikson, Piaget, Kohlberg. We'll cover all these people in the future. But the idea that is these stages are universal, you're going to see them no matter where you are, what historical period. Well, competing theorists argue that pathways of development vary depending on context. And Vaitkowski is generally one of the large names who's the advocate of this theory. So one developmental article that I wanted to point out, the development of executive functioning in theory of mind, a comparison of Chinese and US preschoolers. Now we're going to define these terms later on in more depth, and that's not important right now. But what's important is to understand that both of these concepts, executive function and theory of mind, are thought to kind of be these universal processes, or at least the developmental outcome is universal. All humans have theory of mind. All humans have executive functioning abilities. But we see, if we can get my PowerPoint, there we go. So you can see though, just in the underlined red lines, is that they looked at executive function theory of mind in children in the United States and in China. And moving down to the red line at the bottom, the Chinese preschoolers outperformed their US counterparts on all measures of executive functioning, but were not similarly advanced in theory of mind reasoning. Nonetheless, individual differences in executive function and predicted theory of mind for children in both countries. So what this article is arguing is that executive function, the development of it, again, doesn't matter exactly what it is, it kind of refers to an inhibition, working memory. But the point is that it universally, they argue, predicts and is related to the development of theory of mind. Again, we'll cover that later. But see the difference? The Chinese preschoolers outperformed their US counterparts on measures of executive functioning, but not on theory of mind reasoning. So that suggests that culture, something about the culture of these students, are creating a context by which children develop executive function at a quicker rate, but not theory of mind. So you can see the specific cultural context impacting particular cognitive and psychological developmental outcomes. So moving on to kind of like an OG of everything, Freud, um, we see we see that Freud kind of viewed newborn babies as inherently selfish and they're driven by instincts. And again, we're going to cover this in more detail. But the idea here is that children are inborn biological forces that motivate behavior, and the source of the mental energy that fuels human behavior are those innate biological forces. He believed in unconscious motivation, the power of instincts to influence our behavior without our awareness. And the weaknesses of Freud is that it's kind of ambiguous, internally inconsistent, difficult to pin down and test, and not easily falsifiable. Now, ever so often I get a question, who gives a shit about Freud? Why are we talking about this? Like this shit is not real. Who cares? Well, there's a number of reasons. One, it's important to understand the history of psychology. How did we get to where we are today as a field? Um, and it's important to understand, so that's important from a historical perspective. You know, we understand in medical sciences that previously, 500 years ago, we thought that the issue or the origin of diseases came from, something in your blood, some kind of weird elements, whatever. It took hundreds, thousands of years to figure out germ theory. So, but we learned about it anyway. Also, this gives students the opportunity to critically engage with a theorist, who's a huge theorist in the field, or dead now, but was and still is. I mean, so it gives you an opportunity to critically engage with material, and that's really what you should be doing as students. That's questioning, thinking beyond what the research, the theorist argues, and coming to your own conclusion based on the evidence that we have. So let's move on to another theorist, and that's Erikson. Erikson as compared to Freud. So he was kind of like they called him neo-Freudian, or he was kind of a student of Freud. He emphasized sexual urges less and on the unconscious, irrational, and selfish id. So instead, he focused on social influences, rational ego, and the development after adolescence. Again, we'll get into that in the future. But the idea here is that Erikson had a little more faith in humanity, and he didn't focus more as much on sex stuff as Freud. So spoiler, anytime there's some kind of like sex question, it's going to be Freud to answer. And again, he focused more on social influences and rational development. So he emphasized rational adaptive nature and on the interaction of biological and social influences. His weaknesses is that it is vague and difficult to test and does not provide an adequate explanation of how development comes about. So how do these developmental outcomes come about? He is more focused on more of the innate characteristics of an individual, not how development actually occurs. In contemporary theories, Erikson, he theorized that humans go through 8 psychosocial crisis stages, and I'm not going to read through this, Um, but the important point here is that personality differences reflect different experiences, but also the struggle to cope with differences of each stage. So at certain ages, you automatically advance to the next stage based on biological maturation and societal demands. And the idea is if you don't resolve the crisis within a particular stage before you go to the next stage, level, then you're going to have, deep-rooted issues resulting from your inability to solve the crisis in a previous stage. So you carry these things with you for life. And the goal is to solve each of these crises at these specific age ranges, or you're met with developmental consequences. So again, you can see here kind of this automatic innate stage theorist and how they believe that development occurs. You run into issues at a particular stage, you're going to have developmental issues. So strengths and weaknesses from Erickson, I covered it a little bit already, but humans are pure antisocial trash. So Freud is a much more negative view of humans than Erickson. Biology and social environments interact to form personality. So Erickson, focuses more on biological and social environments, as I stated. And weaknesses. How do you operationally define these stages? We have some definition here, but how can I actually test those in an experimental way? Both Freud and Erickson focus on describing personality development, not on explaining how personality develops. So again, we have all this description of personality, but how is this happening? Why is it happening? That is not addressed by Freud and Erickson. Now, moving on to B.F. Skinner, another kind of seminal, well, some people don't say seminal, but kind of, at least in a US context, um, he's not, he's a seminal psychologist. And he kind of is, associated with learning theory and behavioralism. And this is based on the premise that it's not possible to objectively study the mind, and therefore psychologists should limit their attention to the study of behavior itself. So the idea here is Freud and Erickson are dealing with all these psycho mumbo jumbo stuff that you can't measure. What does this actually mean? Okay, here's what I'm gonna do. Instead, I'm gonna put this rat in this box, and I'm gonna, exactly count how many hits of cocaine I'm giving this rat, how much food I'm giving it, and exactly what this rat is doing. And that is science. That's psychology. That's how we got to do things. He focused on uncovering the general laws and basic principles, learning by looking outside of the organisms. So again, he focused on input and outputs, rewards and punishment. People repeat behaviors with desirable consequences and decrease behaviors with undesirable consequences. So the idea free will is an illusion. What we're presented with are a number of inputs, outputs, rewards, and punishments. And those inputs and outputs, that is what is defining behavior. That's all it is. And I'm going to demonstrate this by putting this rat in this cage and giving him certain rewards or punishments and see how he behaviorally reacts. And Skinner was one to always argue, physics and biology did not get to where it was based on trying to discover personality, states of minds, etc. So we have to just completely ignore any of the minds, states of mind, etc., because it's impossible to measure this. So whatever, ignore it. So he just wrote it off complete was basically his approach. So types of enforcement, and you'll see a video in the link if you're interested from Zach George, this dog trainer here. We have positive reinforcement and negative reinforcement. And reinforcement is when a consequence strengthens the response or makes it more likely to occur. So positive reinforcement, event that makes that behavior more probable. So the idea here, and you can see inertia, which is the dog in the cage, that he is attempting to associate that cage, the kennel, with something positive. So what he'll do is every time that dog walks into that cage, he'll throw a little kibble or treat, okay? And that makes an individual associate, or well, in this case, a dog, associate that kennel with something good. It strengthens a response, and that response is enjoying the kennel, and it makes it more likely to occur that the dog is going to go in the kennel and be, chill and relax and not freaking out. So kibble, so it's two pluses. I'm giving you a reward to increase a particular behavior. Kibble, enjoying the kennel. Okay, negative reinforcement. Behavior is strengthened because something unpleasant is removed or is avoided after the behavior occurs. So say I'm dying to, have the new Burger King spicy chicken sandwich, and I gotta have like three of these things, or we'll be reasonable. I'll have two of these in one seating. Well, I know if I eat these, I'm gonna have really bad heartburn, right? So the idea is I'll take a bunch of antacids before eating that spicy chicken sandwich, which will decrease me feeling like shit after eating two spicy chicken sandwiches. So decreasing me feeling garbage increases my ability to consume spicy chicken sandwiches. So it's always kind of taking away something, which results in increasing the likelihood of behavior occurring. So taking away me feeling like garbage from eating two spicy chicken sandwiches with this antacid, so then I can eat a lot of spicy chicken sandwiches. So moving on to social learning theory and Albert Bandura, always forget his name. Also, he died recently, so RIP to a legend. He argued that we learn by watching others. Humans are cognitive beings whose active processes of information plays a critical role in their learning, behavior, and development. So, he argued, hey, wait a second, Skinner, we actually have a brain and we have cognition and we learn by processing what it is that other people are doing in a social context. So pigeon learning is very different from human learning because of humans' advanced cognitive skills. Humans anticipate what will happen if they perform a behavior, self-criticize, have different motivations. So the idea here is that humans don't always need a reinforcer. They are anticipating using Skinner's language at least, what the reinforcer is going to be, what their outcome is going to be. Also, people come to a situation with different motivations. So if I'm taking this course and I don't care, I'm going to take a C plus in this class and I don't care, then no amount of reinforcements from me are going to make that person strive for an A, for example, because they're not motivated to get an A in this class, and they don't need to be. Their life doesn't require it, and good for them. Um, and also the idea here is that just have more advanced cognitive systems than, name your animal, pigeon, rat, whatever. He also argued for reciprocal determinism, and that is human development occurs through a continuous reciprocal interaction among the human behavior environment. So we're constantly interacting with the environment, kind of creating our own environments. It's not that we're just passive recipients of these inputs and outputs. And specifically, he looked at observational learning, learning by observing other people, and the Bobo doll experiment. And this is an opportunity for you to pause and watch this video. But basically, the idea here is this classic study. These kids watch some adult just go to town, just beat the crap out of this doll, and with no reinforcements, nothing. Nothing was provided to the child. And then when the child had an opportunity to be in the same room as that doll, people who saw the adult just beat the hell out of that doll, they would copy them. Why are they copying them? They weren't reinforced. They got no reward for beating the crap out of that doll. Bandera argues that no, they learn that and are performing that behavior because they learned it from watching an adult do that behavior, beat the crap out of that doll. Next is cognitive theory. Piaget, huge name in the field. His theory is constructivism, which children construct their own understandings of the world based on their experience. So children are active explorers of the environment, and they're going to interact with that environment. They're going to have their own experiences, and that's how they develop. Intelligence is a process that helps an organism adapt to its environment. Through development, humans acquire increasingly complex cognitive structures that aid in adaptation. So you'll see this throughout the book. Piaget has different stages, and he says that each developmental stage is related to a developing cognitive capacity to reason and interact with the world. That's what development is, increasing cognitive skills that allow us to be active explorers in our world and thus develop. Children are not born with innate ideas about reality, and children are not filled with information by adults. Again, they're active explorers, and they learn through, kind of self-discovery and interacting with the world. And now we have the cognitive theory of Vygotsky's social cultural perspective. And cognitive development is shaped by social cultural context, occurs and grows out of children's interaction with members of their own culture. They are not universal. Cultural approaches and problem solving passed down intergenerationally through oral and written communication. And children are social beings who develop through their interactions with wiser members of culture. So the idea here is that development is not universal, just as this states. It's development occurs by working alongside elders or people who know stuff about your culture, and through those interactions, through those activities together, you learn and you develop. Next, an information processing approach. So the idea is the human mind is a computer and examines fundamental mental processes. So attention, memory, decision making. So computer kind of approach, information processing approach. And development involves changes in the capacity and speed of the brain, strategy used to process information, and information stored in the brain in memory. So this kind of, again, pretty straightforward information processing approach to development. Next is Brofenbrenner, and he argued that scientists were studying human development out of context. Development can vary widely depending on neighborhood, home environment, culture, etc. He charged that developmental psychology has become the study of the strange behavior of children in strange situations with strange adults for the briefest possible periods of time. He argues that people are embedded in a series of environmental systems which interact with each other and the individual over time to influence development. So changes arise from ongoing transactions in which changing organisms and changing environments affect one another. So what does all this mean? So Brofenbrenner was basically saying, hey, listen, here's what we do. We're bringing these children to come into this lab, and they're going to perform some tasks that they've never interacted with in their entire life. And then based on that, 10 minutes, 30 minutes, whatever, an hour of instructions, we're drawing these huge universal global perspectives on things. And that's just not how it works. People live in specific historical moments, and these specific types of studies, these designs in laboratory settings, may not be generalizable to the real world. And in fact, not only is development not just universal process, but people interact with their environments in a series of transactional ways. Now this will become clear in this slide here. And this is the biological models, bioecological model, I should say, or the ecological systems theory, how the environment is organized and how it affects development. The developing person is embedded in a series of 4 environmental systems. And this is expanded a little. There's some people argue 4, some say 4 plus chrono system. And the chrono system refers to the historical period. There's actually a link in the notes if you want to check that out. It's a pretty cool video. But the idea here again is that these individuals are interacting within these systems, and they're not only passive recipients of these systems, and they're not only actively influencing their immediate surroundings, but we understand that people make laws, people make changes to the environment, etc. And all these different systems you can see on the right-hand side, from the individual level, from the household level, neighborhood level, country level, world level, all these factors come together to impact development. So it's impossible to just sit there and isolate somebody in a lab for 5 minutes and draw these global, universal conclusions to development, because development depends on so many other factors, as you can see to the right-hand side. And again, he argued that development will be complex because outcomes depend on many factors. Will a parent losing a job be detrimental to a child? Maybe, depending on the historical era, depending on what country do you live in. Do you live in a country with paid leave? Do you live in a country with really good unemployment? Do you live in a country that's really poor? So, that stressor has a different effect depending on what country you live in, what historical period you live in. And, the relationship between environments and people change over time as a consequence. That's just the nature of development. He became disenchanted with comparing children at different SES levels, and he used the PPCT model, process, person, context, time. Again, pretty straightforward here. Context matters, historical period matters, an individual matters. You can have the same environmental influence impact people differently because of the PPCT model. Over the course of evolution and during individuals' development, change and environment influence one another and co-act to decrease the probability of developmental outcomes. So the idea here is you're running into certain circumstances in life. You're interacting with these systems, and these systems increase or decrease the likelihood of specific behavior going on here. So, your country is going through a famine, for example. That is going to increase the probability of something happening at this micro or meso system level because of this macro system. Okay, so basically the environment is related to certain probabilities of outcomes of children and of adults. Okay, now which kind of the scientific method is kind of basic stuff, but what is it? Belief that investigators should allow their systematic observation to determine the merits of their thinking. Theory, a set of concepts and propositions intended to describe and explain certain phenomenon. Don't really need to go in much detail here. Scientific methods, hypotheses, predictions generated from theories. So usually people like colloquially say theory is kind of an idea, but really theories are kind of a collection of vast amount of hypotheses that take forever to develop. So theories kind of contain within them certain hypotheses because they believe certain outcomes are going to occur. Skinner's theory of positive reinforcement. I give you candy and you get better grades. I can test that, right? I can test that hypothesis that me giving you candy will make you have better grades. So within that theory, you automatically have certain hypotheses. A good theory should be internally consistent, falsifiable, and supported by data. So you have to, basically the idea here is a good theory has to be able to be proven wrong, or it's not a scientific theory. Sample selection. A sample is a group of individual studies. Random sampling. It identifies all members of the larger population, randomly selects a proportion of that for a study. Goal is to have your sample represent your total population. So the idea here is it is literally impossible. You will never have a study that will have 1 million participants, let alone whatever the Earth population is, 7 billion. So statistically, there are ways through random sampling to select small numbers of people which are statistically similar to the global population or whatever population that they're interested in it. Collecting data, there's 3 types: verbal reports, behavioral observations, physiological measurements. So verbal reports, they ask people questions about themselves or others. These are interviews, written questionnaires, achievement tests, personality scales. So I can either interview you, I can give you a questionnaire, a survey, whatever. You can see this on BuzzFeed all the time. Take what flavor of ice cream am I? So that's kind of a questionnaire, and it'll tell us, something about you. And you obviously can do this with personality, IQ, etc. The limitations are that social desirability, for example. So the idea is I am going to answer how I believe that you want me to answer. So if one of the question is, do you steal candy from babies? And I actually do. I'm not, and I'm concerned about it. I'll say, oh no, I never steal candy from babies, even though I'm lying, because it's a self-disclosure kind of questionnaire. Children obviously may not have the cognitive capacity to answer something truthfully, or yeah, and they might, just not understand themselves. And cognitively impaired population, so an individual may not have the cognitive capacity to answer truthfully. So it might not be a very accurate or useful way of measuring psychological concepts within cognitively impaired populations. Behavioral observations. So these are structured observations. You create a special stimuli task or situations designed to elicit behaviors. The strength is achieve greater control over the conditions. Limitation is how natural real is this? Is behavior observed generalizable to behavior in the real world? So this is kind of the Bronfenbrenner critique. So yeah, you have great control. I can put you in a soundproof room with no other stimuli to distract you and get a pure measure of whatever it is I'm focused on. But is that how the real world operates? Okay, we know it doesn't. Then how generalizable are my findings to the real world? I don't know. Sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. And that's, something you gotta researchers work through a number of methods. And behavioral observations. This is natural observation is kind of the standard methodology here. And the idea here is you observe people in the real world. So if I'm interested in the behavior of teenagers at the mall, I'm going to sit outside the mall and I'm just going to, take notes or, whatever it is I'm measuring, and just watch teenagers in the mall in the real world. The limitations are that behaviors can be random or rare, difficult to observe. So if I'm interested in the cocaine use of teenagers, I don't know if I'm going to run into that much at the local mall, or at the Starbucks or whatever I'm observing teenagers, because it's such a rare behavior. And also, behaviors are random, so teenagers might just not show up, or might just do something else. And it's difficult to pinpoint the causes of the behavior. So okay, cool, you're out of the laboratory, this is the real world. But how do I know that it's the mall that's causing cocaine use and not the friends, not the pretzel place, not whatever else is going on in that environment? There are so many environmental influences and things going on, which is reflected of the real world. But how do I isolate specific variables that are causing the behavior that I'm observing in this natural context? So that's the idea. And data collection, our final one will be physiological measurements. And this is neurological activity, genetic expression, heart rate, stress hormones in the blood. One technique is fMRI, which measures increases in blood flow to an area of the brain that occurs when the brain area is active during an administered task. So, I can measure brain activity through fMRI, through EEG. I can extract blood from an individual, and that's actually what I did in the Democratic Republic of Congo. I extracted blood from children and mothers to see, to measure stress hormones within that, those people. Now, one limitation of that, especially in the fMRI is, what is it that's actually being measured? So we're getting these brain, activity readings. Now, is the brain causing that? Is there some other factor that's causing that brain activity? We're really just seeing an association between brain activity and whatever task we're giving them. So kind of disentangling what that exactly means is very difficult. And it's kind of been an ongoing process uh, in physiological measurements and fMRI more specifically. So all these methods have strengths and weaknesses. Now, going on to case studies. Now, what is a case study? In-depth examination of an individual or a small number of individuals. Strength, it can provide a rich picture of atypical development. Limitation, generalizational questions. So pretend I'm interested in a very rare disease and like 9 people have it, for example, and I'm just going to study those people for 60 years. Now I'm going to have a lot of information about those, you know, however number of people that I'm studying. So I'm going to know a lot about them. But how generalizable is that very detailed examination to the rest of the population? So you're getting a ton of information at individual level, but less participants is the idea here. And now we move on to experimental method. An experimental method is defined as investigator manipulates some aspect of the environment to see how this affects the behavior of the sample of individuals studied. So you have an independent variable and you have a dependent variable. The independent variable is the variable that is manipulated by the researcher so that its causal effects can be assessed. And the developmental variable is a variable expected to be affected. So a very easy way to actually remember this is dependent variable is your outcome variable. It's dependent on the manipulation of the independent variable. So the independent variable is what we're manipulating. So say I'm testing out a new drug, right? And I want to compare it to an old drug. So I'm going to give one group drug A, and I'm going to give one group drug B. I'm manipulating what drugs each group receives. Therefore, the drug is the independent variable. My dependent variable is whatever I'm interested in. So say it's a cardiovascular drug, something to do with heart disease. So my dependent variable would be the amount of cholesterol within a person. So that's what I'm measuring. That's it. That cholesterol outcome is dependent on the drug being administered to the individual, aka the independent variable. Experimental methods contain 3 critical features. They contain random assignments or participants to different experimental conditions. So like I said, one group gets drug A, one group gets drug B, and it's random. You manipulate the IV. Again, I'm giving one person drug A, drug B. I'm manipulating the IV. And you have experimental control, so I can control other variables. So what if not only did I give one group A and one group B, what if I had a third group and they got no drugs or some other treatment? So I can control what specific variables individuals are receiving, or in that case, what specific drugs an individual is receiving. So then I can be sure that what is causing differences in cholesterol levels are that drug. Strength of the experimental method can infer that one thing causes another, just like I said. So giving a drug, cholesterol drug A decreases cholesterol levels. I know this because I have controls and I have differing groups taking differing drugs. And limitations are generalizable to the real world and sometimes impossible to conduct or unethical. So think of my research. I look at the impact of political violence, of poverty, of economic depressions on child and maternal development. It's not really possible for me to do that ethically. I can fund a guerrilla army and invade Daytona Beach, but there's probably legal questions resulting from that. So there's certain variables that cannot be manipulated by an individual in an ethical way. Okay, so next we have correlational studies. And this is a lot of psychological studies because, again, we cannot manipulate a lot of variables. And we also do not live with these children. So they have all these other environmental influences. It's not as easy as give someone a drug and measure cholesterol, right? There's all kinds of other things that impact language development, for example, or um, you know, self-esteem at 15 years old. There's a lot of history laying behind that teenagers self-esteem at 15 years old. So correlational studies, they determine whether two or more variables are related in a systematic way. There's no random assignment or manipulation of the IV. As I said before, it's not easy. You just can't give someone a drug. I just can't hit somebody with a hurricane and see if being hit with a hurricane is related to um, uh, giving birth to a child with a low birth weight, for example. Not possible. So the outcome variable of correlational studies, one of the important ones at least, is the correlational coefficient. And it's an index of the strength of the relationship between variables of interest. It ranges from +1 to -1. So I just made this up here. These are not real studies. So here we see basically the idea here is that the question would be, is birth weight related to behavioral problems in preschools? And at the top, you see this should be -1, not 1. So let us do this in real time. And this is the magic of science, ladies and gentlemen. Look at that, -1. Okay, so as I stated in the previous slide, it ranges between 1 to -1. And we see that as birth weight goes up, so look at the horizontal axis, 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10. So just pretend this is kilograms. It doesn't matter. Well, it should be pounds, actually. The point is that you can see that as birth weight goes up by going right, the amount of preschool behaviors goes down. So you get that pure diagonal line. Now, this would never happen in the real world, but you can see, just this is an easy example that, and you can see the scale here. So as birth weight is low, look at all those behaviors, 16, or, when you weigh 1 pound, you're gonna have 15 behaviors, 2 pounds, you're gonna have 14 behaviors, 4 pounds, you have 12, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a pure -1. So it's a negative relationship. As one variable goes up, in this case, birth weight, another variable goes down, in this case, pre-K behavioral problems. Now let's look at the bottom here, a positive correlation, R equals 1. Now, in this case, we're going to say as birth weight increases, problem behaviors also increase. Doesn't matter why, this is just an example. So again, you see horizontal axis, it's going from 0 to 4, 6, etc. And the vertical axis, the y-axis, going from 0 to 16. So when a child is 2 pounds, they have 2 behaviors. But when they're at 10 pounds, they have 10 problems as a preschooler. And in the far right, you just see this is just chaos here. There's no discernible pattern. It's 0. R equals 0 means there's no pattern. There's no relationship between those variables. Okay. So we have negative correlation as one variable goes up, the other one goes down, and positive correlation as one variable goes up, birth weight, preschool behaviors go up as well for whatever reason. Now we're going to move on to neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity, or plasticity in general, is the nervous system's ability to change, adapt over time. So it's literally plastic. It's able to move. And a video here, again, a YouTube video in the comments if the embedding's messed up or whatever. So neurons change in 4 ways during development. There's the growth of dendrite and axons, synaptogenesis, which is the formation of new synapses, pruning, which is consisting of the death of neurons, removing connections that aren't useful, and myelination, the insulation of axons with a myelin sheath is fast. So we'll get into this again in the future, but there's 4 ways here. So you have neurons developing through pruning, which is literally killing neurons, getting rid of connections, forming new connections, and making those connections faster through myelination. So more specific developmental research designs, we have cross-sectional design, which is different groups are compared. One type of group is age and provides information about age differences. So measuring the effect of age on an outcome variable, relationship between age and development. So the idea here is I can compare children, or how quickly teenagers can solve a puzzle, and compare it to how quickly 60-year-olds can solve a puzzle, and then based on those differences I can infer that once you hit 60 years old your ability to do puzzles sucks. Okay, so your comparison, so you have this one study in this one moment of time and comparing groups, in this case age, and then coming into whatever conclusion. Now, one issue with this is cohort effects, and that's the effects of being born as a member of a particular generation in a particular historical context. So let's say that I'm interested in how 60-year-olds use computers. Well, versus how well a 10-year-old uses computers or an iPad, whatever. Well, yeah, you can say a 6-year-old sucks at using an iPad. Is that because they're old, or is it because that 10-year-old has been using the iPad for 10 hours a day for their entire life versus the 6-year-old who just picked it up, 2 years ago? And they have a whole different life history of not interacting with technology. So that's one limitation of cross-sectional designs. And basically, this is kind of basically what I stated, but the benefit of this is that it's cheaper than longitudinal designs. What is a longitudinal design? That's when one cohort of individuals is assessed repeatedly over time, traces changes in individuals as they age. It's intra, not inter. So what this is doing is they're following a specific group of people and they're watching them develop over time. Now, one, this costs a ton of money and a lot of people drop out of the study as you go along. So cross-sectional is just like, it's logistically easier, cheaper, and that's why you see it like a ton. And what cross-sectional, what longitudinal studies are looking at is changes within an individual. So that's why it's intra. Well, inter change is cross-sectional. That's comparing groups. So change within versus two groups. And basically, this is what I said before. The strength is that you follow these people throughout time, and you can ask a question like, can early life, I don't know, being exposed to New York traffic, does that predict future health outcomes even if you live in Montana? How else would you study that unless you're following these people for a long period of time? Or at least you would get more information by doing so. So the limitations. So obviously, as we're following somebody through time, through longitudinally, major life world-changing events happens during that time. So we can't just say this is a natural maturation process of psychological processes. So for example, say I have a longitudinal study of whatever. Oh wait, COVID-19 just happened. Okay, obviously that's going to affect that cohort, but is whatever it is that I'm measuring, whatever psychological outcome I'm measuring, is it because of something that happened 5 years ago, or is it because like COVID came and introduced this whole new environment, this whole new set of stressors that are actually driving change in developmental processes? Like I said, it also takes time, costs a lot of money, and in some cases, so example, say you're doing like an IQ test or any kind of test. If you keep administering that same test over and over again, you get testing effects. So people get used to the tests, and you can even see this at certain tasks, that children get better at tasks as they grow up. So, it's difficult, to know if what you're seeing is developmental change related to a specific process that you're interested in, or is it something else? Is it that they're got smart, have a higher IQ, or is it just that they're used to seeing these same questions over and over again, and they've just kind of mastered this specific test? Or is it actually a fundamental developmental change? So another approach is sequential design. So this combines the cross-sectional approach and the longitudinal approach. can reveal which age-related trends are development in nature, which age trends differ from cohort to cohort, and time of measurement effects. So the idea here is, looking at this chart is that, say 2010, you pick up a cohort and you're following them till 80 years old, you're planning on it. Well, in this case, 30 years into this study, in 2040, you pick up another cohort. And in 2070, you pick up another cohort. So you have these different cohorts that you're following longitudinally, and you can also compare them. So it's inter and intra differences. Now, obviously, this is a ton of money, very difficult approach, but I mean, it's a good approach. Okay, so conducting culturally sensitive research. 2/3 of research published in American psychology journals were American. 90% of the world is not US citizens. We talked about this during the syllabus review, weird populations, that is white, educated, industrial, democratic, and rich. So how generalizable are these findings? All this research, all Piaget, all these researchers are from very small groups of people. In the case of Piaget, it's basically his children. So how generalizable is that to the real world? Cross-cultural research requires that the procedures are meaningful in each culture and means the same thing across different subcultures and cultural groups. Translations. So everybody that speaks two languages understands that the language is not going to be identical. Translating something and back translating something is very difficult to do, and making sure that these concepts are understood in cultures, especially cultures that don't interact with these psychological tasks, it's very incredibly difficult. Are tasks culturally relevant mean the same thing? So I looked at executive function measures within the Democratic Republic of Congo. Children do not interact with these kind of weird tasks. It's kind of a American, it's American way of approach, but definitely a weird approach to playing, interacting with the environment that aren't common within these specific context. So is it that the Democratic Republic of Congo child, or born within that country, this Congolese child, is has worse executive function than an American child in, at the same age? Or is it that they're just not familiar with these kind of tasks, and a different kind of task that measures the same construct would produce radically different results? I don't know. I've seen that in a lot of research actually. You know, it's actually a difference There's a difference between performance on a task and actually measuring a psychological process within an individual. So work to keep their own cultural values from biasing their perception. Differences within groups, and different versus deficient. So are groups just different or deficient? Protecting the rights of participants. So this is research ethics. So the idea here is, you can't torture children. Like I said before, I can't buy a militia and have them occupy Daytona Beach and see what happens developmentally. That's why there are IRB boards that basically determine if your research is ethical or not. Informed consent must be voluntary, must not be pressured. Participants can refuse to participate or drop out at any time. So the idea here is that informed consent is a process, and just because you give informed consent one time during a study does not mean you're locked into the study, and I'm not going to let you out of this room. You can leave anytime you want. And finally, debriefing, explaining study to participants, obligation to make sure that participants would not be exploited and provide contact information. So the idea here is after the study is complete, and I will completely explain to you why the study was conducted, what's the rationale, and provide you with contact information if you have any concerns or you want to follow up. And that's it for this week. So thanks everyone. Have a great week. Bye.